February 1917, Russia. After almost 3 years of disastrous campaigns during the First World War, the Tsarist regime was under immense pressure. Russians from virtually all corners of society demand radical change to the government, and change was coming fast. How's it, young Stashers? My name is Dr. Jakub Seidnote. This is Stashy, and you're watching The Historian Stash. Last week we learnt about the first Russian Revolution that happened in 1905. So, following the 1905 revolution, Nicholas II made all sorts of promises to the Russian people and better living conditions. But he never made it happen, and Russia's social and economic problems continued. Then in 1914, Russia entered World War I to support their Serbian, French and British allies. But their involvement in the war proved to be disastrous. Militarily, Russia was no match for its enemy, Germany, even though the Russian military was superior in size. Russian casualties were more than those sustained by any other nation. Food and fuel shortages plagued Russia as inflation soared. The economy was hopelessly disrupted by the costly war effort. Like the 1905 revolution, the conditions in 1917 resulted in demonstrations for bread and better living conditions, with mass participation of workers and peasants. Even though the authorities opened fire and killed protesters, they continued to protest and gained momentum. Tsar Nicholas left the Russian capital, Petrograd, or St. Petersburg, in 1915 to take command of the Russian army front. In Nicholas II's absence, Alexandra, his wife, began firing elected officials left, right and center. During this time, her advisor, Grigory Rasputin, increased his influence over Russian politics as well as the royal Romanov family. Much of this influence with the royal family was because Alexandra believed that Rasputin had eased the pain of her son Alexei, who suffered from a disease called hemophilia. She even believed that Rasputin could heal Alexei altogether. So Tsar Nicholas II appointed Rasputin to a prominent position within the royal court, and so this oak had easy access to the palace and the royal family.
They're just causing an unnecessary irritation.
Rasputin used his status and power to full effect, accepting bribes and other favors from admirers in order to expand his influence. So it was no surprise that he soon became a very controversial figure.
In 1978, German pop group Boney M released this hit song Rasputin, which is playing now. It's all about Rasputin's rise to prominence, describing him as a playboy, mystical healer and political manipulator.
The military disasters of World War I, the disappearance of serfdom or feudalism, and a meddling government bureaucracy all contributed to Russia's declining economy at a very rapid rate. But many laid the blame for the country's problems at the feet of Alexandra and Rasputin.
But when his drinking and lusting and his hunger for power became known to more and more people, the demands to do something about this outrageous man became louder and louder.
A group of noblemen decided that Rasputin's influence over the royal family made him a direct threat to the empire. So in December 1916, they came up with a plan to kill him. The story goes that during the early morning hours of 30th of December 1916, Rasputin was first poisoned by the nobleman. When that didn't work, he was shot 3 times. One gunshot was a close-range shot to his forehead. When that didn't work, the nobleman tied him up and threw him through a hole in the ice into the Neva River, where he finally died by drowning.
We can't just be normal.
Talk about die hard.
They do not call me Die Hard for nothing.
However, this seems to be a myth, as a subsequent autopsy revealed that Rasputin was indeed shot to death. The real story may have gone to the grave with him.
Master!
But unfortunately for the Tsar, Rasputin's death did little to halt the downward spiral of the monarchy. Most Russians had already lost faith in the failed leadership of Nicholas II. Government corruption was rampant, the Russian economy was on its knees, and Nicholas has repeatedly dissolved the Duma, or parliament, when it challenged him. Moderates soon joined Russian radical elements in calling for an overthrow of the monarchy.
The calendar systems in Russia changed during the Russian revolutions that followed. The Gregorian calendar was implemented on February 14, 1918, by dropping the Julian calendar dates of the 1st to the 13th of February 1918. Thus, according to the old system, the February Revolution began on February 23, 1917, thus known as the February Revolution, but according to the new system, it started on March 8.
At the end of January, beginning of February, negotiations took place between the Allied powers in Petrograd to discuss Russia's involvement in the war. Unofficially, Russia's allies were keen on finding out if Russia could still be regarded as a useful partner. On the 27th of February, police agents reported that army officers in Petrograd had for the first time mingled with the crowds demonstrating against the war and the government. Alexander Kerensky, a young Russian lawyer who would later become the head of the provisional government, took the opportunity to attack the Tsarist regime. The majority of the Petrograd population had lost faith in Nicholas II and his government. Thousands of workers flooded the streets to show their dissatisfaction. The first major protest of the February Revolution occurred on the 3rd of March as workers announced a strike to demonstrate against the government. Strikes continued over the following days. Due to heavy snowstorms, tens of thousands of freight cars were stuck on the tracks with the bread and fuel. So even the weather was striking against the poor Tsar and his government.
Oh my lord!
On the 8th of March, the protesters were joined by those celebrating International Women's Day. As the Russian government began rationing flour and bread, rumors of food shortages circulated and bread riots erupted across Petrograd. Women, in particular, were passionate in showing their dissatisfaction with the implemented rationing system, and the female workers marched to nearby factories to recruit over 50,000 workers for the strikes. Protesters flooded the streets of Petrograd, demanding an end to Russian food shortages, the end of World War I, and an overthrow of the monarchy. Nicholas addressed the crisis in the only way he knew how. He ordered the Petrograd Army garrison commander to disperse the crowds with rifle fire and to suppress the impermissible rioting by force. Unfortunately, this didn't sit well with the people. Things started to escalate. the bulk of the Petrograd garrison mutinied. Soldiers joined the rebellion and gathered 40,000 rifles which were dispersed among protesting workers. Symbols of Nicholas's regime were torn down around the city and government authority collapsed. Attempts were made by high-ranking military leaders to persuade the Tsar to resign power to the Duma. The response of the Duma was to establish a provisional committee to restore law and order. The Provisional Committee declared itself the governing body of the Russian Empire. Meanwhile, the socialist parties re-established the Petrograd Soviet, or Local Workers' Council, first created during the 1905 revolution to represent workers and soldiers. Finally, Tsar Nicholas II bowed to the pressure and abdicated on the 15th of March 1917. But he didn't just relinquish power to the people. Instead, the former Tsar nominated his brother, the Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, to succeed him. But the Grand Duke wasn't keen because he knew that he would have little support as ruler. So he said "Niet," and just like that, the 300-year-old Romanov dynasty ended.
Boy, that escalated quickly. I mean, that really got out of hand fast.
On the 16th of March, the Provisional Government published its manifesto declaring itself the official government of the Russian Empire. The manifesto proposed the introduction of civic and political rights and the installation of a democratically elected Russian Constituent Assembly. But it didn't mention the important issues such as participation in World War I, as well as land, which were driving forces for the revolution. Once the Petrograd Soviet was fully formed, it joined the provisional government and shared dual power over Russia. Now, what does dual power mean? Well, the Soviet represented the proletariat, and the provisional government represented the bourgeoisie. The Soviet had better street cred because it controlled the workers and the soldiers, but it didn't want to become part of the government. On the other hand, the provisional government lacked support from the people. So in an effort to gain public support, the provisional government welcomed socialist parties to join them. Power was shared between the provisional government and the Soviet. But it soon became clear that the Soviet was the new top dog.
You're a lucky dog.
It's true.
Meanwhile, Vladimir Lenin, exiled Marxist leader, arrived in Petrograd on the 29th of April 1917. Lenin was born into a close-knit family of intellectuals, and he himself was gifted intellectually. But as a young adult, Lenin experienced the brutality of the Tsarist regime firsthand. First, Lenin's father was threatened with premature retirement by the government, and this eventually led to his untimely death. Secondly, Lenin's oldest brother, Alexander, was suspected of conspiring to assassinate the Tsar. As a result, he was hanged. These two events drove Lenin to become a career revolutionary. When he was 18, he was exposed to revolutionary thought. He met with older, exiled revolutionaries and became a huge fanboy of Karl Marx. By the age of 19, Lenin was a committed Marxist. He was deemed a criminal by the government and was imprisoned multiple times, eventually fleeing into exile. He joined the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party. The party was dominated by two factions, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks, or minority, supported a more progressive change in its collaboration with the middle class and the bourgeoisie. The Bolsheviks, or the majority, believed in a radical and elitist revolution. Lenin became leader of the Bolshevik faction. During the 1905 revolution, Lenin returned to Russia and pushed for an alliance between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat that would establish a revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry. After the 1905 revolution, the rift between Lenin's Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks was bigger than ever. In 1907, Lenin was kicked out of Russia again and would stay in exile until 1917. Then, when the February Revolution broke out, Lenin saw the opportunity to return home. But when he got back, he immediately began to undermine the provisional government, issuing his April theses the next month. These theses were in favor of revolutionary defeatism, which argued that the real enemy is those who send the proletariat into war, the so-called social chauvinists who supported the war. He saw the provisional government as part of the problem and believed that the most effective way to overthrow the government was to be a minority party and offer no support to the provisional government. Initially, Lenin and his ideas did not gain much support, even among Bolsheviks. But then, in July 1917, what would become known as the July Days, approximately 500,000 soldiers, sailors, and workers, some of them armed, came out onto the streets of Petrograd in protest. The protesters seized cars, fought with people of authority, and often fired their guns into the air. The demonstrators, lacking leadership, disbanded and the government survived. Government leaders blamed the Bolsheviks for the July Days and issued arrest warrants for prominent Bolsheviks. Poor old Lenin fled again, this time to Finland. But the provisional government was straining. Change of leadership led to Alexander Kerensky taking over as head of government. He oversaw many reforms like introducing freedom of speech, ending capital punishment, and releasing thousands of political prisoners. But he was still keen to maintain Russian involvement in World War I. This didn't sit well with the soldiers, workers, and peasants who claimed that little had been gained by the February Revolution. Kerensky was expected to deliver on his promises of jobs, land, and food almost instantaneously, but failed to do so. And then came the Kornilov affair. Apparently, Kerensky was so scared that his government could be overthrown, he asked the commander-in-chief of the army, General Lavr Kornilov, to send an army toward Petrograd. But then Kerensky did a complete 180 and reversed the order. Kornilov now felt betrayed by the Kerensky government.
Now I am too hurt. I am shocked and offended and hurt.
So he and his army marched on towards Petrograd. Kerensky now had a real reason to be scared, but because he and his government still wanted to be in the war, he didn't have a lot of troops left to protect him from Kornilov. So Kerensky had no choice but to ask the left-wingers of the Petrograd Soviet for help. The Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, and Socialist revolutionaries all confronted Kornilov's army and forced it to stand down. As a result, the right-wingers felt betrayed by the government, while the left wing was gaining in momentum. Pressure from the Allies to continue the war against Germany put the government under even more strain. Realizing that this was an ideal opportunity for another revolution, Lenin returned from exile once more.
Guess who's back? Back again. Shady's back. Tell a friend. Guess who's back? 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 Guess who's back?
This time, he would stay. Next time, we'll learn more about this October Revolution and its aftermath. Until next time, stay stashy.